So let's look at Genesis 11, and it says the following, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. That was the original idea of God when He created heaven and earth. When the people were there, they would speak one language. Everyone would understand each other. And that would be nice. So we would not need translation, we would not need interpretation, because we all spoke the same language and we all understood each other. But the sin of people was so big that God said, I need to do something. So He changed the system and He diversed the different languages. So He let people speak to each other, and they looked at each other and they said, I don't understand you. And if you don't understand, next thing you do is nothing anymore. You can't do anything, because if you don't understand each other, you just separated. And that's what the people were doing. After the Tower of Babel, they went all the way all over the world, and they had different languages. When you go back in what we talked about, that is that at the day of Pentecost, you had those different languages spoken by the people from different areas in the world, and they all came together in Jerusalem. And at that time, the apostles, they were speaking, and the people were hearing them speak in their own language, which was, remember, it was the dialect we are talking about. So the difference that was made in Babylon was undone in Jerusalem. Of course, that would be great if we had this today. We could all speak the same language. But yeah, today it's a bit different. We all speak different languages. That is still the result of what happened in Babylon. And that gives rise to the problem of what other people are saying about different languages. I remember someone was an American lady. She went to visit a missionary in Portugal, and I don't know if you know Portuguese, which I do not know, but the American lady who visited the American missionary in Portugal, she heard the Portuguese people talking, and she couldn't understand a word of it. And then suddenly, this missionary could interact with those people. And she looked at him in bewilderment and said, "Do you know that language?" "Yes, of course. I mean, if you live there for a long time and you have to work among them, you have to speak a language they understand." That is the fact, the actual fact that we have. I remember stories of the people coming from Azusa Street. They were babbling. I mean, they thought they were speaking a language, but they were babbling. And someone said, no, you're not babbling. You're speaking Chinese. So the man, one of those people, or several of those people, they went to China. And they started their babbling there, and nobody could understand them, because they were what? Well, they were really babbling. They were not speaking Chinese. So we understand now that is not what's supposed to be happening, because the Bible says that if you have someone speaking another language, you need to have interpretation. You need to have someone who can explain what is being said. If you can't do that, you have to shut your mouth, be quiet, don't talk. And you can find this whole situation in the chapter 14 of the book, the first chapter, the first letter to the Corinthians. By the way, just that you know that that's not the first letter to the Corinthians. We call it the first letter to the Corinthians, but in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul is mentioning a letter he wrote before. So this is the second letter to the Corinthians. kind of difficult because then you have 2 Corinthians, and people think, oh, that's the second letter of from Paul to the Corinthians. No, it is the fourth letter. Because in between the first and the second, we call the first and the second, is another letter. So before that is a letter, and in between that is a letter. So it should be 1, 2, 3, and 4. But yeah, okay. Those two others didn't make it to be included in the Bible. For reasons we don't understand, and probably reasons Paul didn't understand. Well, he was not in the position to decide what was going to be part of the Bible. He didn't care so much about that because he was writing under the guidance, the illumination of the Holy Spirit, writing down and giving text to different people. He wrote many more letters, and the only ones we know is the ones we are in the Bible, and the ones are mentioned, like I said, the 1 Corinthians and 3 Corinthians. So what we have here is a whole range of materials, and yes, we can go on and talk about that for a longer time, which we are not going to do, because we need to go to the next part of the course, which is we are going to talk about the deacons. We are going to talk about the elders. And the elders and the deacons, those are the people who are, you can almost say, the governing or the government of the church. Elders and deacons are needed. And you can say, why do we need elders? Let me say it this way. Elders literally are old people. That's what elder means. You have in English, you have the word, the elderly people. That's most of the time people you put into special institutions, and most of the time those people get a visit once a month, and they are called elderly people. But in the Bible, in the New Testament, you have elders. How come you have elders? Well, there is a reason for it. Because in the Old Testament, the elders, the older people, they were sitting in the gate. In the gate, that was the entrance to a town or to a village. And when they were too old to work in the field, they were just sitting there. You can almost say, drinking their coffee or their tea. I'm not going to say smoking their cigars, because that would be inappropriate for us to do so. But anyway, they did some things, and the most of the time, the only thing that really worked for them was the mouth. And they were talking, or the next thing they are specialized in was sleeping. So the elderly people were also the wise people. And so the wise people, they were confronted when people had difficulties. So they went to the older people and asked, can you help us out, because we don't know what to do with the situation. So that is the elderly people. Okay, but let's look at the leadership of a church. And of course you need to have, the first thing you need to have is, why do you need leadership? Why do you need leadership? If every Christian is born again and is filled with the Spirit, why then do we need leadership? Because all are equal. That's another thing in the Bible very clearly, that all are equal. In the Constitution of the United States, it says this also. All people are equal created. So there's no black and white, and there's no, what? Blue and green, does that exist? No. Red, that exists. Yellow exists also. So all of it are the same. In church, you have all the believers. They are all equal. So again, why do you need leadership? Well, you need leadership because people tend to walk and I don't mind to be, or I don't want to be bad thinking about what people are doing and saying, but people are like sheep. They follow one another. If one goes astray, others will go astray. And that's why you need people who take care of the sheep. And we call them poimen. What a strange word. That's the Greek word for pastor. But the Bible itself also explains much in a very deep way, very profound, why we need the help of leaders. And to do so, God gave each and every one of us gifts. Like we've seen before, that there are spiritual gifts, and every one of us have that type of gifts, spiritual gifts. One has the gift of leadership. If you have the gift of leadership, you can only be a leader if you have people who follow you. You can only be a preacher if you have people who listen to you. You can be a preacher to the walls in your house, but I don't know whether that is exactly the same thing as what the Bible is teaching, bringing us. I don't think so. Anyway, some people think it has to go this way. Some people think it has to go that way. So you have people say we don't need leadership, and you have, on the other hand, you have people say, oh, we need leadership. Both can go straight. If you don't have leadership, you're actually not listening to the Bible. When you have too much leadership, you're also not listening to the Bible. Both of them are existing churches, existing groups in the Church of Jesus Christ today. Another thing we are going to talk about is what is called the gender equality. And I must say, I'm personally very indebted to George and Dora Winston, who wrote a book, and the book's name, or the book's title, is Recovering Biblical Ministry by Women. And they go into, not just into the church as such, but also into the Bible, and compare what is happening in church today and what is happening in the Bible. And then they try to find what is covering what, who is doing exactly what the Bible is teaching, and do we have the same ideas of the New Testament? And of course there are links to the Old Testament, but because we are members of the church, so we have this part that is linked specifically to the church. Okay, so we know that according to the Bible, you need to have certain leadership. Well, from the beginning, and literally from the beginning, you had what we call deacons, and you can find that in the book of Acts. But even before that, remember Jesus, what he did in Matthew 10, you find Jesus making a difference between people who are following him, that is generally called disciples of Jesus, and then you had people in leadership, which were the apostles. Those who followed him, he gave them authority. And from that authority, their name, their title, if you call it the title was changed. It's actually, you can almost say, the job description. So we have, in the book of Acts, you have already what we would call deacons. But the deacons are taking the place of the apostles. the apostles, they were actually doing everything. In the beginning of the church, the apostles were actually doing really everything. They were taking care of the people. They had pastoral conversations with the people. People who have questions, they would come to the apostles. The apostles had a time of prayer. Apostles had a time of study, and they preached the word of God. So they did literally everything. But then the Greek speaking, remember that all of the apostles were Jewish, and most probably the majority of them spoke Hebrew or Aramaic, and of course they had a little part in their language of Greek, but not enough to do the real thing in Greek. And so they needed help. But the specific help they needed was not so much learning the other language, but having time to do so. And to make time for their prayers and for their preparation and their preaching, they needed to be separated from the group, the church. And so they found out that the Greek-speaking were complaining, and they said, we are not handled well. You're not doing a good job. And so they decided, the apostles decided to have a group of people who were taking that part of the job over from them. And in chapter 6 of the book of Acts, you find that story. The strange thing is that in the translation, you will not find the word deacon. So many people say, okay, so if you don't have deacon in that specific area, so it's probably not going or speaking about deacons, except that the verb that's being used to describe them is diakonai, which is the word for deacon. So you had a group chosen, 7 in all, and they took over the table or the work on the tables to feed the people from the 12 apostles. And so now you had a separate group. Those separate groups, that was just a beginning, because from them we know that some of them grew out of that specific ministry, and they grew out to be, for example, one of them is well known because he was Philip, and Philip was an evangelist who walked with the eunuch, and he baptized the eunuch. And so you see, there is an ongoing thing already in the Bible of changes. You have the apostles, you have the disciples, you have the deacons, but later on, after the apostles died, one after the other, they needed more information. And so they went back and they found information in the texts written by Paul, the Apostle Paul. But not just by Paul, but also by Peter. So you have those two people, Peter and Paul. Just remember, Peter was the leader of the church at Pentecost. He led the group of apostles. The reason why he's named first always when you talk about the apostles is because he was the eldest, the oldest. And so it was him and the others. And so he took the lead because he was the oldest, and he took the lead in preaching, and so the others were following. And so we have this you can almost say the natural way of leadership being implemented in the church because of God chosen, the Lord Jesus Christ chose them separately, brought them together, trained them well, and then he set them on top of the church. And so they have certain things to do. One of the things the church has to do was bringing the gospel to the world. And that's the last thing Jesus told them to do. And we can find that in the book of Matthew. chapter 28, and you can go there and find out that the real Great Commission, as what we call it, is actually not the world evangelism, but it's making disciples. Because if the church is comprised out of disciples, you have two groups in church. You have disciplers and you have disciples. You are the teacher or you're the pupil. One day, that pupil will be strong enough to become the teacher. And he becomes the teacher of other pupils. And so it goes on and on and on and on. And this happened in the beginning. From, we can say, day one up till now. So someone, so many years ago, someone knocked at my door and told me what I had to do. And so that's what I'm doing now, knocking at the door, at your door specifically, to find out whether you can be the next discipler, to disciple other people, so that they can be disciples, first disciples and then disciplers of other people again and again, so the church can go on and can grow. Okay, that is the reason why the church is in existence. We talked about elders, elderly people. Okay, let's go to, there are no less than 5 types of elders. There's not just one type of elders and then it stops. No, there are 5 types of elders. 5 types of elders, and it's not funny, but it's special actually, that the New Testament church was using the old man's idea of the man sitting at the bench next to the gate, and using that word, because those were the elders of the synagogues. And so they were using the same word, and the word in Greek is presbyteros. Oh, excuse me, what? Yes, presbyteros. It's the same name as the Old Testament. And actually you find some presbyteros in the Gospels. Not presbyteros of the church, but the elders of the synagogues. So the Gospels are a mix of the two. And then in the New Testament, the moment Jesus died at the cross and the forgiveness of sin came into place and into being, and the Church of Jesus Christ started, then from that moment on you had the older people. And one of the older people was Peter. One of the other older people was Paul. And you have the whole list of the older people, or the apostles, in Matthew 10. So the word presbyteros means old people. But it can also mean, for example, the oldest son of someone. So the oldest son in a family, that's the one who is going to inherit the family, quote, fortune. And the leaders of the church have the same title. But funnily enough, we find both female as male elders. So they are not just elders on earth. You have also elders in heaven. In chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, Paul speaks about the female elders, and we will touch on that later on. In 1 Peter 5 verse 1, you have the elders among you. In the same chapter, verse 5, he speaks about subject to the elders. In James 5 verse 14, you have the elders of the church. So that is always the same word, the presbyteros. So whether they are in heaven or on earth, whether they are in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, you have the same word. And it is you can almost say it's a specific group of people who have wisdom, people who are older than other people, have more experience. The next group we have is which we call the Episcopals. And in the sound of the word, you will find Episcopals. It sounds a little bit like a bishop. And that's really where the word comes from, bishop. It's the Episcopals. Epi means over, scopos means seeing. So it's the overseer. It's more or less the manager of a local church. Like we have seen in the book of Acts, that there was managing needed, there was management, they needed to have some people who did the management of the food distribution. And so that's what they arranged, but you have on top, you have someone who is taking the lead. So in Acts 20 verse 28, Episcopals, Titus 1 verse 5 talks about Episcopals. Titus 1 verse 7 talks about Episcopals. So we have in a few verses of the same book the same word. So the first one is elder, the second one is Episcopals. So what we have seen for deacon and Episcopals or overseer, we see for elder and Episcopals also. In the beginning of the church, in the church of the Bible, it was clear. You had elders and you had deacons. But after a while, and that's around the time of the writing of the book of Revelation, when John was freed from Patmos, he became the pastor of the church in Ephesus. And in Ephesus, he was the overseer of not just the church there, but also in the area around Ephesus. There were different churches. And so he was also overseer over them. The local elders came to him to ask for information, to ask for counsel and advice. So, and there they call him bishop or overseer specifically. And he was referred to as bishop later on in the writings. So even among the Christians, in the Christian church at the end of the first century, you had already a little bit of a shift from the original idea of the Episcopals to more or less the one who was leading a group of churches. But that's because of the fact itself that the word literally means the overseer. So some of them have different tasks, and you can find those in Titus 1 verse 9, but also in Acts 1 verse 29, 30. Overseers. Okay, the next one is the one I used before, the word I used before, poimen. Poimen is literally, it means the one who takes care of the sheep. So it's not what we call shepherd, but it's a whole explanation. Of course, we call them shepherds because that's easier. We know when we speak about shepherds, we are talking about sheep. We're talking about someone who is tending the sheep. So in Matthew 9, verse 39, Matthew 9, verse 39, you have this word. 9:39. I have to find it. Okay. It's the idea of the harvest. And in verse 36 you have the sheep without the shepherd. So again, it is in Matthew 9. It is not literally. It is a spiritual look at what is happening. So it's speaking about people who are harassed and they act like sheep without a shepherd. So the word is being used there as shepherd, as what we most of the time when we talk about the church, we talk about a pastor. You can find that also in 1 Peter 2, verse 25, speaks about the pastor. And again, the word poimen is being used. Acts 20, verse 28, keep watch over the flock. Be shepherds of the church of God. Shepherds, the same word again. Jesus calls himself the shepherd and overseer. That means the poimen and the Episcopals of our souls. So, overseer is not only the oversight over a group of people, but also the oversight of an individual person, to look at his interest. So, shepherd is a translation of Greek poimen, and we have it in one specific area. I think it is even translated as pastor. Ephesians 4, verse 11. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. So you have apostles, you have prophets, you have evangelists and pastors and teachers. Again, you have pastors and teachers in the same way as I talked before. Remember, noun, kai, noun. So it's being used in this way. In chapter 2 and chapter 3 of the book of Ephesians, you find always the same way of looking at it. It's the same people. So the apostles, they are also called prophets, because they are mentioned in that way. And that goes back to the Old Testament, because all the Old Testament is written or is being inspired by the Spirit, and He inspired people who write it down. They are writing down the Word of God, which is what we know as the Bible. That is the work of a prophet. Most of the time he would be speaking it, but in this case it is being considered writing it down as being the same as speaking it. So all the Old Testament writers are called prophets. And that's why Jesus is referring to the Old Testament as the prophets. Not just the Torah, but also it's called the prophets, because even Moses was a prophet in that way. And so all the others are later on also prophets. Since the Old Testament was written by the prophets, the New Testament, well, it's written by the apostles or by the people who were very close to the apostles, and they were actually taking the information from the apostles and write it down. So Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and he wrote down what Peter was telling, and he wrote it down in Greek, so we could use it afterwards. The same thing happened with Luke. Partly he worked with Peter, and partly, most of the time, he worked with Paul, and he did exactly the same thing. And that's why we have both the book of Luke as a gospel and the book of Acts as a book in the same way introduced to Paul, through Paul. And so we have all of them, all of the New Testament writers are what we call apostles. So what we have here is we have apostles and prophets in the same way. That means that they consider the New Testament writers at the same level as the Old Testament writers. And that's why all of the books we have in the Bible are going back to prophets or apostles. Both are elevated by what the Spirit was bringing into them. He inspired them to write it down. And so that is the difference when you look at the text here. That is that it is important for us to see the difference and to see the similarity. So we have this poimen being shepherds and overseer. Jesus calls himself the poimen and the Episcopals of our souls. And we have them in Ephesians 4, verse 11. Because Ephesians is kind of special. Because when you look at the book of Ephesians, you will see that the book of Ephesians there are two parts. You have chapters 1 to 3 and chapters 4 to 6. And 1 to 3 is kind of an introduction or a theoretical idea. And then you have the chapters 4 to 6, it's more practical, what you do with it. So that is how you have to look at the book of Ephesus. And then you see that it goes from the first part to the second part. It's being taken over from the theoretical to the practical part. Okay, so that is what we have about the poimen, the pastors. And number 4 is the kerux. The kerux, and we find them in 1 Timothy. In the case of Paul, he was that when you read 1 Timothy 2 verse 7, he said, and for this purpose I was appointed a herald and an apostle, and I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying, and a true and faithful teacher of the Gentiles. So you have the idea of a preacher being for both the people inside the congregation and both outside to the people to preach the gospel. We would say that is an evangelist, but that is not what Paul is saying, because he is speaking about the evangelist when he speaks about Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1 verse 11, and of this gospel I was appointed a herald and an apostle and a teacher. So you have those three together again. So he's actually clearly saying to Timothy twice in two different letters, he's saying the same thing. Okay, that is my task. That is what I'm doing. And the same word is being used again in 2 Peter 2 verse 5. That is going back to an Old Testament figure, namely Noah, and Peter calls Noah the preacher of righteousness, and he's using the word again, kerux. So the kerux of the righteousness, which is a reference, of course, to the Old Testament, but you can almost say that, how can Peter say that Noah was a preacher of righteousness? Because we don't know what Noah was doing, whether he was preaching in the same way as Paul was preaching. We don't know. The only thing we know is that the same word is being used both to describe Paul and Noah. So in number 5 we have didaskalos, and for didaskalos we have to go back to Ephesus, to the book of Ephesus, chapter 4, verse 11, and it says, remember, so Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers. And remember the link between the two, noun kai noun, meaning that you have a noun, then you have the word and then you have a noun again. That links up, that speaking about the same. And we've seen that in several places. And in this case, we see that both the pastor then the didaskalos, which is the teacher. By the way, teacher is being translated in other languages, for example, in French or in Latin as doctor. So you have the doctors of the church. It only means the teachers of the church, the people who teach the church how to go about. Those who are trained in theology, and then they bring that theology to the people. The word is being found in several places in the New Testament, in Romans 2 verse 20, in 1 Corinthians 12 verse 2, and of course here in Ephesians 4 verse 11, but also in Acts 14:23, and in Titus 1 verse 5. So it's not something that happens one and then you have to have the explanation, because you can go through all these different texts and find out exactly what the teacher is all about. And of course the teacher, that is one of the spiritual gifts. So now we understand what it means. Okay, and then we have the issue I was talking about, the noun kai noun. When you have noun kai nouns in the Bible about those 5 different people, you find them shepherd and overseer, and here you find pastors and teachers, prophets and apostles, and so on. So you have different wordings coming together, saying it's about the same people again. So let's go to the next item, which is the qualifications. What type of qualifications does a deacon or an elder need, and how much difference is it between the two? Qualifications mean you have to qualify as an elder. It means that there are certain things that are expected from you. Not so much only, or not only, let us say it that way, not only in a theological matter, but also the time you are a Christian. I mean, if you are a young Christian, it would be very dangerous to appoint that person as an elder in the church or a deacon in the church, because you don't know if after a year or two he changes his mind, maybe even he takes the church with him to go astray. And then other things like the behavior. One thing that is being mentioned for both deacons and elders is having a family and being responsible for the family. It's actually, if you can't take care of the family, how can you take care of the Church of God? So there's a number of things you have to take into consideration. It needs to be, okay, it doesn't need only to have a wife, okay, because then many people may apply, but he has to be faithful to his wife. He has to be above reproach. You have people who think they are good, and I'm not saying they are not, but some people think that what they call good is actually bad. And the Bible teaches us that those people who do those things, who changes the good into bad and the bad into good, they are not worthy to be trusted. So, although people can desire, as we have seen in 1 Timothy, they desire a very good, a noble task, it is important that they have to abide by certain rules. They cannot they cannot be drunken. The difference between deacons and elders is actually not so much about those things. The only difference between the two is that an elder must be able to teach. That is a specific item being mentioned with the elders. That is not an item with the deacons. So when you look at all the text, you will find that is the difference. For the rest, it's in the same way. It's actually, you can say, if you if you are good enough or sufficient, trained enough, and being accepted in the church for a deacon, but you can also teach as a spiritual gift, then you can be an elder. I've seen people, very good people, being broken in churches because they had the good qualifications, but they were not accepted in their church as such. Although they were able to do certain things, they were not accepted. That's another thing that is extremely important. That is that when you have spiritual gifts, it's not so much that you have them, but also that you show them. And the church has to confirm that spiritual gift in you. So it's not so much, I can hand out money because I have money enough. No, it speaks about to serve the other one, to diakonoi the other one, the people outside, but also the people inside the church. Actually, the Bible says first inside the church and then outside the church. So, again, when you look for a specific office in the church, whether it's deacon or elder, you have to understand that the church is going to look at you, and they are going to, try to find out whether you are as good as you say you are, whether you do the things according to your heart or just because of you think they need to be done. Because there's a whole lot of difference between those two. And it's again very important that you even accept the fact that people are, they'll say it this way, accepting you or not accepting you. Okay, the next thing we are coming back to the elders and the deacons again, but just a word about bishop. Remember we talked about the Episcopals, and that's the word from it. It's the word bishop that's being that comes from it. A bishop or an Episcopos, and remember there is a church being called this way. The Episcopalian church actually is using that word, but Episcopal or the Episcopal, elder, overseer, pastor are actually synonymous. So they are different words for the same thing, for the same issue. Okay, and then remember in the New Testament, that is the guiding word.